Listen, I think it's not really hard to debate that Sonic is one of the best franchises when it comes to music. Since the beginning, music has always been a focus in the Sonic franchise, just to capture the atmosphere of the levels and what's going on. Starting with Sonic 1, where they had Masato Nakamura, the bassist of Dreams Come True, a Japanese pop band, coming in and making music for the games, just literally looking off screenshots, but they knew what they wanted by getting him. The vision was always to make catchy tunes that fit the level and the atmosphere. Even with Frontiers capturing the somber vibe, the more calm, chill areas, along with the cyberspace being more digitized, being more EDM. Each Sonic soundtrack has taken the assignment that it's given with the concept and ideas and absolutely nailed it out of the park to make the catchiest tunes that you will ever find in any video game. Now, the last time I was doing a full Sonic soundtrack analysis, it's actually the first video on this channel. I was talking about the Shadow Generations soundtrack and whether I thought it was fire or not. If you want to know my full in-depth analysis and thoughts on the Shadow Generations OST, I'd recommend checking out that video specifically. I'll leave it in the link in the description, and I'll also have it pop up like on the eye thing. Y'all know how YouTube works, but it's gonna be there. But generally, as it's a Generations game and it mainly focuses on remixing old tracks, I focused on comparing it to the old tracks, but I also compared it to how Sonic Generations remixed the old tracks. And a lot of people in the comments weren't exactly seeing what I was saying when I would keep saying that Sonic Generations had amazing remixes and the Shadow Gens remixes just weren't up to that par. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to do almost like a follow-up video where I kind of delve more into why I feel the Shadow Gens soundtrack wasn't quite up to par, and I really want to highlight that through using examples of Sonic Generations and its remixes and why I believe Sonic Gens does it just so well compared to Shadow Gen. So this is probably going to be another long one, so strap in guys, get your popcorn, get what you need. We better dive into Sonic Gen's OST. Now first of all, let's dive into how is Sonic Generations structured. Of course, with Sonic Generations you have 9 different levels throughout Sonic's past. You have the modern stages with modern Sonic, and you have the classic stages with classic Sonic. Obviously the modern stages are trying to aim for a more sound that's more fitting of modern Sonic games. You know, kind of bringing more of that rock, more of that energy, more of that hardcoreness to the tracks. Meanwhile, with the classic levels, you have more of a synthy type vibe going on. It's not got to the point of EDM like with Sonic Forces and whatever they decide to do afterwards, but it is very much still trying to make something in line with the classics, in line with like that Genesis kind of sound, but not fully going into it. I think the goal and the aesthetic of what they're trying to achieve with each set of remixes is very important to keep in mind while going forward. First of all, I think it makes much more sense for Sonic Gens to have more distinct remixes between Act 1 and Act 2 than it does for Shadow Gens to have more distinct remixes between Act 1 and Act 2, simply because, yes, in Shadow Gens, the Act 2s are fully 2D compared to the fully 3D Act 1s, but it's still the same character, he's still the same vibe, you know what I mean? But with modern and classic Sonic, they're two, yes it's the same Sonic, but it's two very different styles of Sonic. So it makes sense to have different styles of music. And the issue that I believe they've had with that, with Sonic 4 and Sonic Forces and stuff like that, is I think they went too much into trying to use the Genesis sound, rather than making it sound inspired by but still having the modernisms of what we have. I feel like they tried to go too much into the Genesis sound, and I think in a 3D looking, not 3D gameplay, but 3D looking, using a 3D model for classic Sonic, in that kind of aspect, I feel like there's just a dissonance there. You know, it makes a lot more sense hearing that in Sonic Mania as opposed to a Sonic Force. Also, I feel like more emphasis was put on trying to make it sound like the classics than really understanding why those compositions were so good when they were limited with the hardware that they had at the time. I mean, literally, just listen to anything from Sonic 3 and compare it to a Sonic Forces classic Sonic level and you'll understand what I'm talking about. Anyways, I feel like I got a little sidetracked. Let's dive into an example with the first level that you get to experience in Sonic, Green Hill Zone. Honestly, this track is such an easy example of what I'm talking about. Listen up here, right? Let's go first with Act 1. Now, Act 1 of Green Hill Zone, the melody is literally the same from back in Sonic 1, it has that 16-bit Genesis sound chip being used. Now if you listen closely, you'll see the main differences, the bass and the drums are very much updated. That's what gives it that kind of more modern sound, like it's fresh and it's updated, but it's still that classic sound that we're used to. It's a good mix. Now with Act 2, you can clearly hear the difference and hear where the modern influence is coming into the track. The main melody is more synth based, however you can hear that drum set in the back. It's definitely more live band kind of feel. And of course you've got Jun Sonoe rocking out on that track. This style of remixing works because you've got modern Sonic who's all about the boost, way faster gameplay than the original classic Sonic. So obviously upping the tempo of the track kinda helps it to fit more. Now this tends to be the trend they use when it comes to remixing the other classic levels, Chemical Plant and Sky Sanctuary. You'll notice for the Act 1s for both of those stages, they pretty much use the exact same sounds from the classic games for the melody. It's only the drum and bass that are updated to give it a new feel, and some new sound effects thrown in every now and then. Meanwhile, the Act 2s don't really go for the exact same melody, they more go for melodies almost kind of inspired by the original melodies. Like for Chemical Plant Act 2, it almost takes a little bit for the track to charge up before you start hearing those memorable riffs and melodies. In fact, it even slows it down slightly to give you more time to sit with them notes as they play. I think this is a really interesting choice considering for Green Hill Zone, they actually sped up the melody for Green Hill Zone in the modern act. But for this one, I guess Chemical Plant is already fast enough, it kind of makes more sense to slow it down. Really interesting choice. Now Act 2, whilst not using the Genesis sounds, still almost kind of sounds similar enough, but it's enough to give it that modern feel with the drum and bass. Now honestly what they were doing here was very different to what they did in Shadow Gens, because Shadow Gens didn't really remix any Genesis sounding songs. So I don't really have a direct comparison to make there, but we'll be able to make those comparisons in this next section when we go over the Dreamcast era. Now while we call this the Dreamcast era, we are just going to go over the fact that Sonic Heroes isn't on the Dreamcast, but who cares, it's Dreamcast era. Now for this next section, we'll be going over the remixes for Speed Highway, City Escape, and Seaside Hill. And I'll be using them to compare to the remixes of Radical Highway, Space Colony Arc, and Rail Canyon from Shadow Generation. Now for the rest of the Act 1 remixes, they actually don't use that Genesis sound. They kind of go for something more inspired by it, but still a bit more modern to just reflect the fact that these tracks are from a more modern era in time where they have a lot more access to different sounds. And I feel like that's the key part of why these remixes work so well. They work because they aim to still keep in mind the era of what they were remixing, whilst also combining it with their main goal. With these Act 1 remixes going forward, they still want to make it sound like classic Sonic. They still want to give him that audible identity that they've given him from the first 3 remixes. But they still respect and realize that they're remixing modern songs. They're remixing Dreamcast songs. So they still want to keep that sound in as well and not just turn it into a Genesis cover that you could find on YouTube or something. And with a lot of the Act 2 remixes, they really do try and up the drum and bass and up the speed of the tracks a little bit, just to reflect the fact that it's modern Sonic, it's boost, it's fast. But as we get closer to the more modern era, where he already has the boost and the tracks are already built around that, the remixes become a bit less and less distinct. They become more like enhancements than full-on remixes. But we'll get there when we get there. For Act 1 of Speed Highway, I really like the processed digital sounds that they use. I like the electronic guitar and the synths. I feel like they really take the original melodies from Adventure and they really give it that techno vibe that really gives it that classic feel that they already set with the first 3 remixes. I'm also a big fan of that drum fill they use before some of the drops that really sounds like it is from the Genesis games. Like, I swear you can hear that exact same do 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 in like Sonic 3 or something. I will say, Act 2 sounds very similar to the original Speed Highway, however it just feels more full, more bombastic, like there's more going on with the drums and the guitars. It's subtle, but it's an enhanced difference. You can clearly see that it's a different track, it definitely has a different feel to it overall. Now with City Escape, this is probably the most interesting track for me to talk about, because City Escape is such an iconic track just in general. When it comes to Sonic Adventure 2, there's a lot of iconic music from it. Obviously Live and Learn is one, but City Escape is the first track that you hear. It's the intro track to the game essentially. First time you play, you pick up that hero story, you're hearing rolling around at the speed of sound. That's like a sleeper agent for any Sonic fan. They will start singing with you, trust me. Now this one is so challenging to get right, because on the classic side, you have to give it the classic feel that you've been building up throughout the game, but you still have to stay true to the feel of Adventure 2 and using them vocals, which there wasn't really any vocals in any classic tracks. So that's a new element that you have to incorporate and still make it make sense. Meanwhile, with the modern remix, you have to still keep that upbeat feel. You know, don't stray too far away because it's already essentially there. But at the same time, you don't want to add a bunch of unnecessary elements that end up detracting from it instead of enhancing it. But I feel like they did these remixes super justice. Now the Act 1 classic remix of City Escape is so good. It is probably in my top 3 remixes of this entire game. They take those vocals, but they completely change up the instrumental. Obviously the general melody is still there, but it is all synths and all techno sounds, and I just absolutely adore what they decided to do with it. There is like almost no remnants of the original City Escape in that track. All that you really have to go off is the melody that they've reincarnated and the original vocals. And once you get to that one drop section at the Follow Me, and there's a whole guitar solo thing, bro, that bit is absolutely crazy. I'm not gonna lie, I rock out to that every single time. At this point, it's not just a level theme, it's just a good song, bro. It's just a good song. This is just one of those cases where it's like, I can't really compare it directly to the original because it just stands so well on its own. Now I think the Act 2 remix for City Escape is very interesting because it is very much within the same kind of sound as the original, but they very much try not to just make it sound like the original enhanced. Like, they take a whole new kind of riff, kind of based around the general riff for City Escape, and they use that as a main. So while the original City Escape is more do 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 do, the modern City Escape remix is more do 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 do. And I think it's really refreshing. It's nice because it's not just a copy and paste of the original, but it does its own thing in a familiar enough way. And it still feels very modern. And if I compare these to the Adventure 2 remixes that we find in Shadow Gens, I think that's where we can clearly see the main issue that I have with these remixes highlighted. Now whilst I do very much enjoy the Space Colony Arc remixes and the Radical Highway remixes from Shadow Gens, my main issue is they don't really sound like Shadow. In and of themselves, I generally like them as remixes. They came off very trailer-like and very epic and very hype-inducing, and it's just like, okay, we're really in this now, we're doing this. But for me, what it doesn't do, which the Sonic Generations remixes do, is keep the audible identity of which the character is known for. If you want to know what I'm talking about, listen to those remixes and then listen to Radical Highway in SA2. Listen to White Jungle from SA2. Listen to For True Story from SA2. I believe that's where Shadow's audible identity lies, and I think that's where they fumbled with Shadow Gens. Shadow's auditory identity is very grunge. It's very rock, but it's also very metal in that sense. It's sinister, it's jungle, it's techno. It's got elements of Sonic's rock, but it very much is different and knows what it is. And ironically, while I am just talking about the console version of Sonic Generations, I will bring up the 3DS version just to make this point. Listen to the Radical Highway remixes from the 3DS version of Sonic Gens. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That's how these remixes should have been. And I said that in my Shadow Gens video too. They keep those grungy techno elements while still making it sound new and refreshed and updating certain things. You know what? Even just to drive this point further home, I'm gonna bring up a game I've absolutely been slandering when it comes to music, but they actually do a good job in this case. The Sonic Forces remix of White Jungle, Eggman's Facility. Now, whilst this track still has some synth action going on, it doesn't absolutely dominate the tracks like they do in Shadow Gens. You notice the guitar is a bit more prominent, but the drum and bass elements are still in there. They fade in and out at points, but they're still very much prominent. It keeps that auditory identity from the SA2 version, but adds something new to keep it updated. That's what we want! And those Shadow Generations remixes just don't do that. They completely forgo the auditory identity that SA2 laid out in favor of just taking the melody and adding EDM elements to it, and bam, that's it, we got a new remix. It doesn't feel like Shadow, it feels just like a general remix, which they can still be good, but it just doesn't sound like Shadow. Alright, I feel like I've made my point so far, but we still got some remixes to go, so let's continue. Now the Seaside Hill remixes are some of the weakest remixes for me from Sonic Gens. They're still decent, but I feel like they don't do enough of what they're supposed to do in order for them to be good. For example, Act 1 does make use of electronic elements, but it's not really that much. It feels like they kind of held back on this one. And with Act 2, not that much is different, even in terms of with the drums and the bass. It's all very similar. There's just a few extra synths added in there to enhance some parts, but it feels very, very similar to just the original Seaside Hill. Now if I'm to compare these remixes to the Heroes remixes that we heard in Shadow Generations, the remixes of Bullet Station and Rail Canyon, I'd say those remixes do a lot more to separate themselves from the original tracks that they're based on. However, they don't really sound like Shadow, whereas the Seaside Hill remixes, while they don't do as much and they're not as differentiated, they still very much sound like their Sonic counterparts. Now, let's move on to the modern era and see how these remixes stack up. Now for this section, I'm going to be comparing the Crisis City remixes from Sonic Gens to the Kingdom Valley remixes from Shadow Gens, just as another way to prove the point I've been saying throughout this whole video. Now with Act 1 of Crisis City, I really like the digitized and the processed instruments that they use. It almost sounds like there's some bit crush on them, and I don't know, for some reason that just really sits well with my ears. Meanwhile, with Crisis City Act 2, very similar to what they did with Kingdom Valley Act 1, they very much focus on upping the intensity, since a lot of the tracks from Sonic 06, whilst they are energetic, they're not nearly as energy pumping or as rocking as the modern tracks, considering the use of the boost. And in Sonic 06 there was no boost. They were still fast paced, but not as upbeat as the modern tracks. So with these remixes, they really add a lot of drum and bass elements just to give it that extra kick to it. I will say, the changes that they did with the strings and the melody do help to make it feel a bit more intense and a bit more upbeat along with the drum and bass edition. And that's why I feel like it differs to what they did for Kingdom Valley with Shadow Gens, where it was relatively untouched, just minor drum and bass additions added in there just to kind of give it that more upbeat, which it seems like it's a common theme for them to do with the 06 tracks. Now next up is Rooftop Run, and I'm going to try and explain my thoughts using this kind of analogy, so stick with me here. I'm gonna try and make this make sense. The way I see it, the original Rooftop Run from Sonic Unleashed feels like a good day out at the park. Now Rooftop Run Act 1, the classic remix, sounds like if your friend went out for that really good day at the park and came back and tried to describe it to you. Now Rooftop Run Act 2 sounds like if you went to that same park a couple years later and you're a bigger kid now and you can go on more of the stuff, you can climb more, you can do a whole lot more at the same park. Now if any of that made sense to you, we have probably a similar type of brain. And if it didn't make any sense to you, I'm just gonna try and analyze it properly. Now the original Rooftop Run, it has those guitars, it has the violins, it has that melody that just sticks in your head, and it has that live band in the back that just all comes together to form this great track. Now Act 1 keeps the general melody and the elements, but changes up the vibe a little bit. It's a little bit slower, it's a little bit more bouncy, it's a little bit like it's trying to take its time with it a little bit more, which matches with the classic Sonic gameplay. Now as far as I can hear, they don't really go for any synth usage in this one, but they do have a piano going on in the back, which I think really adds to that delightful sound. Now Rooftop Run Act 2 is a lot closer to the original, but it does have that piano in there, and a little bit less of the intensity on the band, just to kind of even things out, and I think the changes make enough of a difference, although they remain subtle. Now last but not least, we're gonna talk about Planet Wisp. Now I think the OG Planet Wisp is such a beautiful composition. The gentle piano melodies backed up by the strings are just sublime, and the bass line and the guitar just cap everything off just to make it a serene experience, especially matched with the level theme of Planet Wisp, which is just running through grass, but also the construction work as well. It's incredible. Now I think both of these remixes lack a little bit when it comes to recreating that same type of vibe in their own way, but they're not necessarily bad. To be fair, you don't get to hear the music too much over the spike and rocket wisp music constantly, but we're gonna ignore that for a sec. Act 1, they really choose to bring back the techno vibes, which I get it, it's classic Sonic, it's what you've been doing, but I don't necessarily like it the best for this one. I feel like considering the direction that they went for the other classic remixes of the modern stages, it kinda is a bit odd to bring back all the techno and go as hard on it as they did, so it ends up sounding a little jarring in comparison. But on its own, it's not necessarily that bad. And Act 2 once again goes for a more full, more enhanced feeling, with the strings feeling a bit more intense and the drums also feeling a bit more intense, which kinda takes away from the sereneness of the original, but it does amp it up a little bit. And now that we've covered all the level tracks and all the level remixes, I think it's pretty clear why Sonic Generations has the better soundtrack and the better remixes than Shadow Generations. I discussed it more while diving into the Dreamcast Era section, but I'm gonna round up and just say it here once again. It's the personality and the auditory identity of the remixes which determines why I feel Shadow Gens is kind of lacking with its remixes compared to Sonic Gens. And I feel like the reason why this is happening is because we're not getting as much character identity in the music anymore. I feel like they're going for a general sound, and you can see that from Forces to Superstars and now Shadow Gens. They want to go down this EDM techno kind of route, but it doesn't represent what we've known about the characters, and especially in that Dreamcast era where the music was more around the characters. Now I always bring up Sonic Adventure 2 for this example because I believe that game really just did it the best. You know, Sonic had his rock, he had his butt rock going on, Knuckles had the hip hop and rap going on, Tails and Eggman had the more like techno kind of vibes in their own ways, and then Rouge had the jazz and Shadow had the grunge. It just made so much sense, and I feel like now they're trying to sterilize everything. They want everything to be very similar or the same. They're squeezing everything into one genre, and that just doesn't work for me. We need to bring back the character identity into the games, and especially if they're going to be bringing multiple playable characters back, like we got Shadow playable in Shadow Gens, Frontiers they added Knuckles, Tails and Amy. They need to have more individuality in their music. Now as a super duper side note, I do want to bring up the fact that I have played the Shadow Generations DLC and I've heard the Westopolis remix, and that was a pretty good remix in my opinion. Although I do wish they kept some of those miscellaneous sounds in that go with the melody, like the ringing sound and stuff. They kind of took some of them out, but overall it was pretty good. You know, they added more of the techno elements and the DMB elements, but I feel like they didn't overdo it. They knew where to place it throughout the track and it really made sense. And that works. That's literally one of the best remixes from Shadow Gens automatically, just off of that. Now I might talk about some other remixes. There are plenty of Sonic remixes if we look throughout the series. If we're talking about the racing games, TSR, Transformed, all of them, they have remixes of songs too. Maybe I'll cover some of those. I'll do like a miscellaneous Sonic remixes video. But I also do want to talk about the original tracks too. If there's another soundtrack you guys want me to talk about, let me know in the comments below. If you agree, if you disagree with my analysis, let me know in the comments below. Do you think the Shadow Gems remixes are better than the Sonic Gems remixes? Do you think the 3DS Sonic Gems remixes deserve more of a mention? Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading them all, I'll be checking them out, I'll be hearting them, so make sure you come through. And if there's anything else you want to hear me talk about, music wise or otherwise, just let me know. You know where to let me know, in the comment section down below. Alright, like it if you like it, subscribe. Breeton's been talking, and now I'm done. And I'll see you guys in the next video. If you want more Sonic videos, there should be a playlist right there for you to click on. And yeah, that's me done. Alright, peace.